Hello everyone, and welcome to the next installment of Wrestling with RahXephon. For this next episode, we're going to look at Makoto Itsuki, the White Snake, and see just what makes him hiss. Now, while Makoto doesn't have a super complex arc, or even character necessarily, as he basically just goes mad with power due to his inferiority complex, he does have an arc, and he does have a relatively defined character, in addition to relevance to the lore and a lot of relevance to the plot. This, combined with his general stage presence, signify him as an important character and thus one deserving of his own video. He serves an important purpose as a sort of antagonist, and this marks him as a great addition to the cast for that alone. Starting off though, we first meet Itsuki in episode 4 as a quote-unquote Federation observer, which does a good job immediately establishing him as someone who is part of the cast, yet is distinctly apart from it. He makes snide remarks in his first appearances, but it's not until a little later where he starts to show his true arrogant and rude side, especially when it comes to matters regarding to power plays. This nature is an extremely cruel and manipulative one, which is bent on one thing, and that is to massage his ego and soothe his massive inferiority complex. To this end, he manipulates a very emotional woman to get knowledge to feed to the Bobbit Foundation, leading them coming for Quan, whom, thanks to his mole, Itsuki has figured out has actually awakened. This wasn't enough though, and having tasted power and wanting to hold on to the RahXephon, Itsuki goes ahead and usurps Kunigi when Kunigi kind of allows Ayato to run away to Tokyo Jupiter, and thus Itsuki takes over Terra Command. In this capacity, he immediately proves his abrasive and rude nature by bossing around a lot of the staff, firing some of them, and basically forcing everyone to either bow to him or get lost. In this capacity, he also decides to launch a bold new operation against the Mu, Operation Downfall. Now, this is an attempt to prove his greatness and cement his legacy by destroying the Tokyo Jupiter and hopefully the Mu inside. He doesn't necessarily seem to have planned out anything past the initial stages. Ironically though, Operation Downfall only leads to his own downfall, as the massive Mu counterattack that it spawns, as well as the fact that he ignored Federation orders to not go through with this, sees Itsuki fired and basically deposed. Having been abandoned by everyone at this point, Terra, the Federation, and the Bobbit Foundation, Makoto enters a state of mental flux. He basically has a mental breakdown, which accumulates in a murderous rampage, which sees his own death occur. Now, Makoto is a very solid character in RahXephon, and its presence is important not only for what he does in terms of material deeds, but also for the peeks he affords us into the workings of the Foundation, and just generally providing some kind of antagonistic presence to a series whose antagonist is kind of vaguely defined in a lot of places. Although Makoto is rather one note, his character is still a pretty interesting one, and while I do wonder why he was the one that got the backstory episode, it does go a great length to explain why he is the way he is. The way he is, of course, is cruel and manipulative and egotistical in the extreme. While capable of feigning concern or decency, he cares not really about anyone else or what anyone else does or their well-being, but only for himself, even living by the words that relationships are simply based upon common self-interest. He puts no value on others, or human life in general it seems, and he seems to expect others to do the same or have similar mindsets. And while I don't want to get too into this because I think it's pretty obvious, it should be said that Makoto's character is also a very obvious commentary about the dangers of arrogance and kind of isolating yourself. He thinks that he knows better than everyone else and that he can move all the pieces by himself without any kind of interference from those around them, and his hubris ends up isolating him, and thus he's unaware of any real threats to his power, which of course lead him to overextending and kind of causing his own downfall. Again, Makoto's arc in this regard is pretty obvious, so I don't necessarily want to expound on the very obvious lesson of, hey, don't be a jerk because then you'll be isolated and then you'll regret it in the long run. He was not like this from the beginning though, and it's important to note that almost every aspect of him originates from his massive inferiority complex, which in turn stems from a traumatic childhood. Everything he did in his childhood seemed to be frowned upon, and there was very little room for self-expression, all the while he was constantly being deemed an inferior clone, having been of the D variety. As such, Makoto has fed his ego in an attempt to kind of overcompensate for everything. Everything he does isn't so much to establish his worth and power to others, so much as to do so to himself. Having been called defective for essentially his entire life, he's very bitter and he wants to prove that he's not. This, plus the disconnect installed in him from his very traumatic and off-putting childhood, lead him into crazed actions without any kind of empathy or thought for others. While none of this justifies his actions, it is an interesting backstory for the character, and Makoto and Itsuki are great examples of how childhood traumas, or lack of childhood socialization, can warp people if these issues are not properly addressed. Both suffer similar trauma in the same environment and deal with it in very different ways, yet still regret how they do so. Itsuki withdraws completely. He grows quiet and generally starts to doubt himself and his abilities. He grows apathetic towards others and himself, and he struggles to get over any kind of setback and struggles with just kind of taking action in general. He basically checks out and allows things to run their own course, and he basically allows himself to be taken along for whatever ride seems to be going on. Makoto does the exact opposite, on the other hand. He heats up and lets his bitterness bloom into full-blown arrogant psychopathy. Instead of withdrawing, Makoto enjoys being the center of attention and forming relationships with others, if only to serve himself and his own ego and his own desires and goals. While Itsuki is consumed by his fixation on his flaws and his failures, and he kind of talks himself into basically not doing anything, Makoto does the exact opposite. He senses that if there's any opportunity he can take, he should take it. Where Itsuki is haunted by inaction, Makoto overplays his hand on many occasions, and while Itsuki stagnates, Makoto goes off the rails. And going off the rails is one thing that this guy really excels at, and while he's obviously a character that we're not supposed to like, due to his abrasive attitude and just how unpleasant and crazed he is, his screen presence makes him come to life, and it makes him someone that you love to hate, and enhances his role and presence in general, as RahXephon is generally lacking some sort of defined antagonistic force. I know that the Mu are the bad guys, and the Foundation is probably evil too, but RahXephon does an odd amount of trying to justify their actions or get us to empathize with them. It's really odd to me, in fact, how much it seems like it wants to say that there are no real bad guys in the show, even though we see the Mu commit massive war crimes, and I'm pretty sure the Bobbit Foundation is some kind of shadowy organization somehow running everything behind the scenes. For this reason, Makoto's greatest service to the show is his presence as a strong antagonistic force, even if he is only kind of a tertiary antagonist. As while the Mu and the Foundation are probably higher up on the totem pole of RahXephon antagonists, they're also extremely nebulous and frankly not really fleshed out enough for us to really get behind defeating them. Makoto, on the other hand, is very much so defined. He's a jerk, plain and simple, no weird plot, no conspiracy, no odd attempts to humanicize him, no odd attempts to get us to kind of like him or understand his points, no backtracking to make him seem justified, no knowledge gaps that leave space for us to question his motivations. Nope, just a bad guy who wants to feed his ego and do bad things to do so. He does everything he does because he's insecure, and he doesn't know how to handle it properly, and as such, he's a massive jerk. Which is honestly really refreshing when all the other antagonistic forces only have very sketchy plans, motivations, presences, developments, etc., etc. I would go as far to say that, on a personal level, Makoto is the most interesting of anything that RahXephon has close to an antagonist, and he's definitely the one that makes the most sense. To be honest, up until writing this, I never noticed how poorly RahXephon handles antagonists before this, and how kind of weird and nebulously they're handled in this series in general. And while Makoto is considered a failure, note how he failed to kill Lord Bobbin, even though that was his last wish, the White Snake is still a fun antagonist, even if he's not the main antagonist. He still provides a very clear antagonist for at least some episodes, and for that I must say I'm thankful, as while I like complexity in stories, and while it is cool some villains have motivations that aren't so clear-cut, RahXephon goes to the point where I don't really know why any of the bad guys do anything they do, and as such, it's kind of confusing to me. And I even question who the real bad guy is at this point. Not because any of them seem justified, but simply because it's kind of bungled to that extent. And Makoto's not. He's very refreshing. He's just a douchebag. It's great, really. It's nice that there is a character that's easy to hate, because Sometimes you just need a bad guy in a show to do bad things to get us all riled up, and in that role, Makoto excels. In that role, he's not a failure. And while I'd hate to meet him in real life, I would say that it is wonderful seeing this character come to life on the screen.